So when I'm not in my studio making YouTube videos, the other thing I do for a living is I play gigs. I'm a touring musician and I spend a lot of time every month on the road, touring all over the country, playing a range of gigs. Now, I've been doing this pretty regularly since about 2006. So in the nearly 20 years I've spent on the road, I've clocked up quite a lot of miles. In this video, I want to share with you 9 of my personal gear tips that I've learned in that time. So if you're someone who wants to start gigging and you're just kind of thinking about how to make that work, or you're someone who's quite new to gigging and you want to kind of streamline and make your whole gigging setup a bit more efficient, these tips will hopefully help you out. These are things that I've learned about packing gear, using gear, setting things up, and just the whole ethos that I apply to my entire guitar rig for being on the road. This video today is brought to you in partnership with musicradar.com. Down below in the description, you'll find a link to the Music Radar website. You can go over there and read a full-length article that I've written about this as well. So everything I talk about in this video is written in that article in more detail. So if you want to check that out, scroll down and hit the link down below. All right, so gear-wise, in this video, I'm using this Chapman Guitars ML3 Pro X. This is plugged into the Blackstar Studio 10 6L6, which is running via the 2-notes Torpedo Captor X. I'm also using quite a few different pedals, as you'll see in the video as well. All right, so tip number 1 is pack sensibly. Now, when I say pack sensibly, I mean take the gear that you know you need for the show that you're doing. Now, as guitar players, you know this and I know this. We love gear. We love watching videos and looking at pictures of our idols' guitar rigs. And let's face it, we've all dreamed about touring the world with a huge stack of amps behind us, a guitar boat with 25 different guitars in, a pedalboard the size of a small country, and a guitar tech to run all that for us. But in the real touring world, that is something that doesn't really happen that often, unless you are touring with a huge band with huge budgets. The reality is you're probably going to be carrying and setting up your own stuff. So you do have to use your own initiative when it comes to how much gear you're going to take. So as a rule, I normally take 2 guitars for a show. I will sometimes take 3 if I need a guitar setup for a specific thing, but as a rule I take 2, 1 main and 1 backup. I tend to gig with combos because I just find that works better for me. So a good 1x12 combo and a pedal board with everything I need to get through the show. Now we can also make sure that we pack a range of things to help us out. So I always pack a DI box. I've always got a DI box with me. The reason for this is at the end of my pedal board, which we'll get onto later in this video, I have an amp sim pedal, which serves as my backup. This allows me to feed that straight to the front of house if I need. It's always useful to have a capo. I like to keep 1 or 2 capos in my gig bag, just because you never know when you need to change the key on something. Plenty of these things, plectrums. I actually carry an entire bag of Jim Dunlop custom picks with me when I'm on the road, because again, these things go missing, you lose them, they fall out of your bag and you'll never see them again. Always carry a range of tools because you never know when you need to fix something on the road. I always carry a screwdriver, a pair of pliers and a couple of other Allen keys and little things in case I need to do some emergency maintenance. And spare strings. Do not leave the house for a tour without multiple packets of strings, because you will need these. If you're going on the road for a while, you will need spare strings. Tip number 2, use the best cables that you can actually afford. Now, guitar cables range in price from very, very cheap to very, very, very expensive. Now, if you look at some of the very high-end cable manufacturers, you will find cables that go over 100 or maybe even 200 pounds. There's some expensive cables on the market. But I don't really want you to go out and buy those cables. They're great cables, but you don't have to buy them. Now, what I always suggest to people is spend the best money you possibly can on cables without obviously bankrupting yourself. The reason for this is cables are really an integral part of playing live. They're the thing that connects your guitar to your pedal board to your amp, all your pedals together. You know, if a cable goes down, it's pretty bad for the show. It doesn't leave you in a good position. If you use a guitar wireless, that's cool. I tend to gig with a wireless as well, so my guitar isn't connected to my pedal board by a cable, but I always keep a backup cable. Again, you can add that to your list from point 1 in this video. Take spare cables with you as well. Now, I always say to people, spend the best money you can on cables without putting yourself out. You don't have to spend big bucks, but do not buy £5-6 cables with molded ends because they will ultimately let you down. The cables I tour with are these Blackstar Pro cables, Blackstar Professional Series cables, and these retail at about £25 a cable. So they're not cheap, but they're also not super, super expensive. I always have at least 2 of these in my case, one of which connects my pedalboard to my amp, and I always have a spare just in case I have a problem with my wireless. And then in my case, I also have a couple of older cables that I've just had for years, which again, just serve the purpose of being spare cables should I need them. Same goes for patch cables on your pedal board. Don't buy cheap 50p cables. Spend a bit of money, make sure you get good connections, good solid cables that aren't going to break down after a couple of shows. Point number 3, use an isolated power supply. So now that we're on the topic of pedal boards, isolated power is very, very important. Now, I'm touring with quite a big board. I mean, there are plenty of guys out there on the touring circuit who use much bigger pedal boards than I do, and there are plenty of people who use smaller boards than I do. For the shows I'm currently doing, this is sort of everything I need for a show. There's probably a few things on here that are on there just for my own fun. I could probably knock a pedal or 2 off, but as a general rule, that's pretty much what I need to get through a gig. But when it comes to powering this, I'm using a Walrus Audio Phoenix. Now, there's a ton of great isolated power supplies out there, but isolated power is very, very important if you're running a pedal board. Now, the reason it's important is because every pedal on here has its own output from the power supply. Now, you can get pedal power supplies that are daisy chains, which each pedal connects to the other with a single power source. And these work great if you're maybe only running 1 or 2 pedals, but they're very prone to electrical issues because you're not really getting a good solid electrical signal to each pedal. And also, if there's a problem with the daisy chain, you could lose your entire pedal chain. So an isolated power supply like this one has multiple outputs. You can't see them very well because of where they are. Under here, there's a series of output sockets, and each one of those sockets feeds an individual pedal. So if a single power cable goes down or one of those sockets goes down, I only lose that pedal. I don't lose the entire thing. But the isolated side of this means each of the outputs is isolated, which means they give clean power to the pedals. Now, when it comes to power, if you have a lot of pedals like I do, and you're not running an isolated supply with clean power, you're going to get a lot of noise issues. A good isolated supply will give you pretty balanced sound wherever you go. It should minimize any noise issues you could come up with. Because, when you're on the road, you don't know what the venue's power is going to be like until you plug everything in. And the last thing you want is a lot of hum and hiss and buzz because your power supply isn't getting clean power. So make sure you get a good isolated power supply for your board. All right, so gear tip number 4 is for those of you out there who are going to be using pedal boards. So when you're putting a pedal board together, there's not really a set rule on how you should organize your pedals. You can put your pedals in whatever order you want. As long as the sound you get out inspires you, then that works fine. But if you're new to putting pedal boards together, or you're trying to put together a board that's going to work really well for a tour, there's a few best practices you can follow. So I've got my board set up to kind of cover all eventualities. It's a pretty versatile board, and it can pretty much get me through every single gig I need. So signal chain wise, I do follow a lot of the best practices personally because I find it just gives me the best results. So my guitar goes straight into my tuner. Now, tuners will work pretty well anywhere in the chain, but I like it first because I know it's just getting a direct signal from my guitar. The tuner then feeds the wah. That's there because I just, again, like the way that it reacts right at the start of the chain. Then I go into the HX Stomp XL. Now, this is at this point because of some of the things that it's running. So I've got a pitch block in here that allows me to detune my guitar by a semitone digitally without actually changing the tuning on my guitar. And then I've got a compressor running. So if I was using a pitch-based pedal, I would still put that before my drives, and a compressor I would also put before my drives. Just in this instance, they're in here. I'm running out of the loop of this then into my drive section, which starts here and then runs along the board here. I've got them stacked lowest to highest gain. And then the last 2 here, the second side of the King of Tone and the Timmy, are just different lead kind of boosts. One is slightly quieter than the other, just so I can cut through in different ways. That runs into my delay, which runs into this little reverb here. This is only here if I need extra reverb for something, or I just want to add like a different texture, because I always choose combo amps with reverb built in. So that's just there as, you know, a more reverb button. That then goes back into the HX Stomp XL, which then has a couple of different modulations, and that goes out to the amp. Now, best practice wise, I would, in an ideal world, like my modulations to be before my delay and my reverb. But just because of the way I've got this board set up, I couldn't do that in this instance. And it doesn't really make that much of a difference. But in an ideal world, I would like these two things to be after this. But because of how this is functioning, for a point which we'll get into later on in the video involving this pedal, these needed to be before it to make sure that works in the correct way. But we'll come on to that later on in the video. But yeah, as a general rule, I like to go tuner, wah pedal, pitch and compression, drives, and then you go into your, in an ideal world, modulation to be next, then reverb and delay in whichever order you like, but I'm going delay, reverb, modulation. Those last three are kind of interchangeable if you want. That's just the way I've got them set up in this board. Tip number 5 is learn how to dial in a good amp tone. Now, the most important thing is that you've got a good tone that you can work with from your guitar amp. So if you're touring with your own amp, you'll know the amp pretty well. You'll know how to set it up. But sometimes when you tour, you are subjected to renting in backline or using venue backline, and that can sometimes cause a few problems. So what I always do is I always set an amp to a good, solid, clean tone. So to do this, you need to understand a few basic principles of how amps work. And the main thing is really getting the EQ balanced. It's very easy to miss EQ an amp. And if you do that, your pedals will only bring out the worst in the amp. If you have a good, solid platform that you can then use your pedals to build on, that will get you through every single gig you ever need. Now, I love combo amps. I love the simplicity of them, and the less the amp does, the better for me. One of my favorite amps is the Blackstar Studio 10 6L6. And the reason for that is it's one channel, and the layout is very simple. It's got a volume control, a gain control, a reverb control, and a tone control. It doesn't even have a multi-band EQ. It's got a single tone control. Now for me, I like a clean amp with a nice balanced sound, like this. So for me, that kind of clean tone works great because it's very well balanced. It's got the right amount of lows and highs for what I need. So if you're dialing in an amp to have a great basic tone, whether that's a clean or an overdriven tone, the best way to start is to set all your EQs to 12 o'clock. By doing that, you get the amp's tone stack to an almost neutral point. So while obviously the amp is still imparting its own frequency voice on the sound, by setting all the EQ controls to noon, you get the most balanced representation of how the amp should sound. And at that point, you can start making tweaks. If you want more low end, you simply bring the bass up a little bit, or you can cut some low end the same way by turning that control down. Same goes for the mid-range, same goes for the top end, the treble. Now, what you don't want to do is you don't want to be making extreme movements. If you have the bass set on halfway and you want more bass, don't turn it to 10, because then you're going to add all the bass. And that might sound great in isolation, but then when you play live, you're going to get lost in the mix. Try and do little movements just to fine-tune the tone the way you want it. You'd be surprised how little you probably need to move those controls from the midnight position to find the sound of the amp. Once you've done that, you can then build on that sound with some pedals. Tip number 6 is understanding how to stack gain pedals. Now, if you're like me and you're using an amp as a clean platform, or you have your amp set up for like a low to medium gain crunch, you can stack different gain pedals on top to get different results. Now what you could do is you could just get one gain pedal and crank the gain, but then you're kind of reducing the amount of options you have. If, like me, you have multiple gain pedals on your pedal board, you can stack and combine them for different flavors and different kind of ranges of gain. The cool thing with stacking gain pedals is you can get some really interesting tonal variations too. The overall tone that you hear coming from the amp always takes on the character or the most of the character from the final pedal in that stacked chain. But everything before it kind of brings a little bit of its own EQ flavor to the party as well. So that's something to consider when you're choosing your pedal board order as well. If you're putting your gain pedals in a certain order, if you've got a specific pedal that you really like the sound of, its overall frequency and kind of tone spectrum, that should probably go at the end of your gain signal chain, because then you're not affecting the tone of that too much when you stack other things in front of it. I always like to stack my gain pedals from low to high gain too, just so I know where I'm going when it comes to adding new gain flavors. I can either have a high gain pedal on straight away and then hit it harder with some lower gain ones, or if I'm playing with some lower gain pedals, I can add a higher gain on top of that. Everything you do kind of creates different flavors. So I'm going to play a bit to show you. So if I just put on the MXR Duke of Tone, that's going to take my amp from clean to this. So on its own, that's not a high gain sound. If I turn on my clon pedal, this happens. So it did get a bit louder, but it also added more gain. I can turn on my King of Tone, and this happens. So you can see that gave another completely different gain flavor. If I'm playing with this gain tone, I could stack something on top of it. Or before it. And that opens up a ton of new possibilities when it comes to the different range of gains I have. If I just have one gain pedal, I can't do that because I'm just stuck to one sound. So stacking gains is a great way to unlock some extra flavor and sound from your overdrive signal. Tip number 7 is a little bit of an extension on tip number 6 on gain stacking. And this is using pedals to kind of enhance your existing sound or to cut through the mix a little bit more. So let's say we're just playing with a good rhythm tone like this. And I need that to just poke through the mix a little bit more. I could set up a pedal on my chain either before or after it that just slightly alters the tonal characteristic to make it do what I want it to do. Now in this case, I tend to do it before. I like the MXR Duke of Tone, which is up here on the board, being that pedal. I like that because it just hits the front of whatever I'm using a little harder and then just adds a little bit more top end presence. So if I'm playing with that tone, and then I turn on the Duke of Tone, this happens. So by doing that, it gets a little bit thinner, but it cuts a little bit more. In isolation, that tone might not be the best guitar tone, but where that really works is when you're playing on stage. Because when you're on stage, there's a lot of other stuff going on. You've got the dense frequency arrangement from the drums, the bass, the vocals, the monitors, the room, everything else affects the tone. So live, that sound will actually just cut through a little bit more. It'll just bring my guitar a little bit more present in the mix in some of those denser sections because it shaves off some of the lows, just lets it poke through a little bit more. That, again, like I said, doesn't sound great in isolation, but live that is so useful. I can also use pedals to boost me up when I need to be heard in the mix as well. So for this, I have This side of the King of Tone, set up as a boost for mid-song leads and choruses, and then I have the Timmy then over here as my lead boost. So if I'm playing with this kind of tone, and I hit one of those two boosts, you're going to hear quite a big volume lift. So if you want to be heard, you can use gain pedals to really push you over the edge as well. That Timmy always gets me through the mix, and that always lifts my lead lines very, very loud so they can be heard clearly when they need to be. Tip number 8 is to learn the tonal variations you can get from just your guitar. Now, I know we've talked a lot so far about dialing in amps and dialing in pedals, but you can really change a lot of the sound from your guitar as well. So these principles are going to be different depending on which guitar you have. This particular guitar has 3 pickups, a volume, a tone, and a 5-way pickup switch. So I can do quite a lot of different things with this guitar. Now this setup may be different in your own guitars, but a lot of these principles still apply. So if I have just a good core rhythm tone like this, I can change that tone quite a lot with just the guitar. Now, one of the problems that we all face is sometimes the guitar in its basic state like that doesn't work the way we want it to work. There may be something we're not hearing or something we want to hear and we can't work out how to get it. And that can sometimes spur us on to start making really big changes to our amp or to our pedals and going down big rabbit holes. But sometimes the answer is right here. And your guitar really is something that is incredibly versatile, even more versatile than you may think, because we often tend to just leave everything set to 10. So if I'm playing with that kind of tone, the first thing I can do is just change pickup. If I go to the neck pickup, I'm already somewhere different tonally. If I go to one of those in-between positions, that gets a little more quacky. So straight away there, I've got a couple of different tonal variations. I could roll the tone control back slightly, and that will slightly darken the sound. So you could hear how much that tone control affected the brightness of it. That is one of the things that all guitar players should be aware of, is set your tone control to 10 and then roll it back till you're happy with the high end. I tend to leave most of mine around 8 when I'm gigging, because it just shaves off enough of that top end and it's not overpowering. You can also clean up your guitar a lot with the volume control. If I'm playing on 10, I'm getting the full output of the pickup hitting my pedals. But if I go back a little bit to 7 or 8, cleans it up slightly. That's really useful live because you can set your sound with the volume slightly lower, and if you don't have a gain boost for solos on your pedal board, you can use the volume control for that. It's a little bit more subtle than using a boost pedal, but it does give you a little bit of a lift. Your volume control can also clean up your sound a lot if you drop it down to about 3 or 4. How hard or soft you pick and where you pick can also have a huge dynamic effect on the guitar. The guitar is a very dynamic instrument. If we pick hard, we get a real kind of biting attack from the guitar, and if we pick softer without changing anything else, we can get a huge range of sounds. We can also brighten up the sound by picking closer to the bridge and darken it up by picking closer to the neck. So learn how your guitar works, understand the dynamic range that you have available to you, what you can do with the volume knob in terms of cleaning up or boosting your sound, how your pickup switch works, and how your tone control works. And then pay attention to where you're picking to get different tones as well. And then tip number 9 is have a backup plan. So I've mentioned briefly that I've got an amp sim at the end of my pedal board. And this is the whole reason my board is wired the way it is. So I'm using an amp live, which is mic'd up, feeding the front of house, but that's also feeding my in-ear monitors on stage. But if the worst should happen and my amp goes down, then I lose all my sound. So I got this board set up with a contingency plan built in. Now the HX Stomp has amp models built into it, but I'm actually using this pedal here, the Walrus Audio ACS1. This is set on the right output of the HX Stomp. So in its current state, everything goes through the board as you've seen, out of the left output, which feeds my amp. I have a second patch programmed in here, which disables the left output and enables the right output, which feeds all of this into this pedal, which is now my guitar amp, which feeds the DI box I talked about earlier in the video, which then feeds the front of house. So if my amp goes down, I've got 2 button pushes on here, and that reroutes everything through this pedal, which now becomes my amp, therefore saving my sound. I'm currently playing some quite big shows. Usually there's over 1,000 people in every night, and the last thing I want to be doing mid-song is crawling around on stage, unplugging things, looking for solutions to why my sound has stopped. If the worst should ever happen, I've just got to hit 2 buttons and I'm straight back in the game, and hopefully quick enough that no one notices that there's even a problem. So when you're building a rig to go on tour, you should always have a backup plan. For me, this is my backup plan. Your backup plan could be taking a modeler with you. It could be taking a second amp with you, but whatever it is, make sure you've got some kind of redundancy plan. And the same is true for everything else I've talked about in the video. Have spare cables, have spare strings, have spares of every single thing you need to get through your gig. Because if you only take one of it, and it's something that is essential to your gig, and that goes down, your gig is going to come to a pretty abrupt end. So make sure you have a backup plan for whatever it is you need to get through the show. So there you go, there are my 9 personal gear tips that I've learned in all my years as a gigging guitar player. I hope some of these tips have helped you out, and if you're new to gigging, maybe these are some things that you've never thought about before, and it will help you build your gear up ready for your first gig or your first tour. Let me know down below how you got on with some of these tips. If they're things that have been useful to you, I'd love to hear which ones have helped you out. If you perhaps are someone who's already gigging, or you have some cool tips that I've not talked about, please share those down below too, because anyone who's watching this video will benefit from anything you throw down in the comments as well. So if you've got some tips or tricks that I haven't talked about, please share them down below as well. While you're doing that, don't forget to hit that like button, and if you're new here, please consider subscribing to the channel as well. If you want to read the full-length article over on the Music Radar website, that's also linked down there in the description. Thank you guys so much for watching as always, and I'll see you soon.